Hi, I'm Steven Anderson, and this is 5 Minutes with Dr. Jan Ciborowski. How long have you been involved with aquatic ecology?
Well, I've been studying aquatic ecology pretty well since I've been at university, and I've been at the university for about 30 years, and I've been working on Great Lakes aquatic ecology since I've been here.
Now, what can you tell us about the lower than usual water levels in Windsor this year?
Well, we've been seeing this happening on and off for quite a while. In fact, when I first came here in the late 1980s, the water levels were at record high, and so there were all sorts of stories about how we're going to deal with flooding and all of those problems. And it's only since the late 1990s and in the last 10 years or so that the water levels have gradually been going down. So it's a fairly recent problem, and it's really tied together with some of the climate change things that we've seen.
Now, what do these water levels kind of suggest for the surrounding ecosystems?
Well, an awful lot of the productivity, an awful lot of the ecosystem health that we see really relates to where the land meets the water. So it's on the shorelines. We have all sorts of wetlands that support the birds, and when we fish, most of those fish lay their eggs, and the larvae spawn in the wetlands and along the shorelines. So if the position of the shoreline changes, that's really important for the ecosystem.
Now, are there any other regions experiencing similar issues?
We're seeing climate change occurring, throughout North America and throughout the world, but we've really seen major differences on the Great Lakes. And although we see the water levels going down on Lake Erie to some extent, the greatest water level losses are actually in Lake Huron and at Georgian Bay.
And why do you think that is?
It's because the shoreline is shallower there, so a small difference in depth makes a huge difference in where the shoreline edge is.
Now, what should people be most concerned about when it comes to these issues?
Well, what we're really seeing is changes in the weather patterns, and that's what's resulting in the change in the levels. We've had a little bit less rainfall, but what's really happening is that as the climate warms, the lakes are covered in ice for a shorter period of time, and what's causing a lot of the water level loss is evaporation. So when we have hot weather, or even if we have cool weather and the water being exposed, we're constantly losing water to the atmosphere.
Now, you're involved in many different kinds of projects, namely and most recently is Project Gleam. Can you tell us about that?
Well, again, on the shoreline, we see many sorts of stresses going on as our cities expand, as we build more houses, as our agriculture goes on. All of that development removes the natural features of the land, and that causes stress to the environment. So with a whole series of colleagues around the Great Lakes, we've pooled our knowledge together to actually build a map to say, what are the biggest stresses to the Great Lakes and where do they actually occur? And we've built a color-coded map that shows where the greatest threats are to all of the regions of the Great Lakes, the shoreline, the middle of the lakes. We've also done separate maps to say, where are the greatest resources? What are we most dependent on in the Great Lakes? And so where we see the greatest threats overlapping with the greatest resources, that's where we have to be most concerned.
And where are we seeing the greatest threats?
Well, the southern Great Lakes are obviously under the greatest stress. So Lakes Ontario and Lakes Erie have the highest populations, the most development, and that's where we see the greatest number of different risks. And this can be things like runoff from agricultural land, the building up of the shoreline, invasive species like zebra mussels coming, and the threat of Asian carp. All of these things add different types of stress, and they all add up together. So individually they may not be fatal or a concern. If you start to add them all up, you get to see where the greatest risks really are.
Now, through your research, are you finding any ways where this can be remedied or maybe less stress can be taken? And
that's what a lot of our research is to say, we've got so many problems, so many needs. Which are the worst ones? Where can we get the most value for the dollars we have? So we can look and see which levels are closest to either getting really bad or closest to being restored for the least amount of resources and cost, and that's where we could say that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. That's where you can best solve the problems.
All right, thank you. I'm Steven Anderson, and this has been 5 Minutes with Dr. Jan Ciborowski.